Welcome to another episode of the Essential Craftsman podcast. I'm Nate. I was online a couple weeks ago and I clicked on an article about some cruise ships that were being sent to a scrapyard. And there were photographs there, and the cruise ships were beautiful. They looked like they were brand new. You can't tell, but squeaky clean and indistinguishable from one that would have been carrying guests and had a track and swimming pools. And apparently with COVID, they are now obsolete and worth more as scrap than as a cruise ship. And so it really blew my mind. And I read that article, and I've got us a guest today to learn more about this. And his name is Peter Knego. He is an ocean liner historian and journalist. And we're going to be talking all about these cruise ships, the history of them, kind of how they came to be and how they're made, how they're dismantled and scrapped, and everything in between. I'm really looking forward to it. This is something that I know very little about. I did go on a cruise ship once, and I really enjoyed it. It was a totally new experience for me. Those things are just massive. If you've never been on one, you almost can't believe just how massive they are. It's like a building on its side. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Without any further ado, Peter Knego. Peter Knego, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast here, and welcome.
Thank you, Nate. It's a pleasure to be here.
Will you, for my sake and the listeners, start with just kind of your background and how you maybe first got interested in cruise ships and how you got to where you are today as some sort of an expert on and the history of them and where they are now in terms of this dismantling. And can you talk about how it is you got into this area?
Sure. As a little kid, I was always interested in the Titanic, like every kid, dinosaurs, Titanic, that type of thing. But I really started getting very, very hardcore into ships when I was about 12 or 13. I was assigned a paper in American history to discuss the Lusitania. And I thought it was some battleship. I had no idea. And then I started doing all the research and found, oh my God, another 4-stacker ocean liner sank by the bow, huge maritime disaster. It was opening whole new vistas for me. So I found out there were other 4-stacked liners. And then the Art Deco era came in with ships like the Queen Mary. And the more I learned about ships, the more I thought ocean liners were just an incredible subject matter. And I've always tended to be a little over the top with my interests. I'll get fascinated with something, and for a year or two, that's the only thing I'll talk about. And then I'm on to something else. With ships, that's stuck since I was like 12 years old. So, we're dealing with like 40 years of ocean liner fascination. The more I read about them, the more I love them. And right around that time is when all these great liners, the ones that were still left, they were called blue water liners. They sailed to places like Australia, South Africa, the west coast of Africa, South America, places that had warm weather, as opposed to the Atlantic liners, which had all pretty much disappeared by the late 1960s. And these ships were still around, but they were going really quickly because the fuel crisis and also the 747 jumbo jet had just come online, and they could fly jets all the way to Australia now instead of having to stop 2 or 3 times. So that was like the end of it for these beautiful blue water liners. And they were going to places mainly in Taiwan, a scrapyard called Kaohsiung, the New Amsterdam, the Homeric, the Orsova, all these beautiful ships were being scrapped. And I was like, wait a minute, I just discovered these and they're leaving our realm. They can't do this. And so it just really drove me crazy. So at that point in time, I had a Kodak pocket instamatic camera, but I told myself, I don't care. Whatever ship comes to Los Angeles, I'm going to visit and document it. And then when I was finally an adult and able to actually afford a better camera and to travel, I started making trips. I did research and found out where in the Ukraine or China or some other really, really far off place that was exotic, some of these old ships were still around. They had just, they were in their 3rd and 4th careers, and they were nearing the end of their lives. So I said, okay, I've got to go document these ships. So for about 10, 15 years, I was out there going to all these crazy places, sending faxes, if you remember that
Yeah.
way of communicating, to
Yeah.
ship owners and begging them for permission and offering them my photos in exchange for access to these old ships.
Huh.
So come around the early 2000s, um, the ships were no longer just sitting around. The price of steel was going up, and countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh were really looking for steel. So they were buying all these old ocean liners and they were sailing off to India mainly for the passenger ships, the ones that I liked, because they have a market there right outside of the scrapyard where they sell all of the fittings and furniture, toilets, life rings, whatever. They had a market for it. So the passenger ships were going there. And I finally decided, this is my chance not only to document this, but to actually go there and salvage some of the stuff. I was in the music business. The industry was collapsing
Mm.
because of downloading. So I thought, well, okay, maybe this is my new thing. I
Mm-hmm.
know so much about these ships. I've done nothing with this knowledge. So maybe I should start buying some of these things, not only for my own use, but to sell to friends and people who collect such things. Mid-century modern was really popular in the design market. So
Mm-hmm.
these ships were loaded with Scandinavian, Italian, British, all this stuff from the 50s and 60s that you just can't find in quantity anywhere.
Mm.
So I would go to India. I made my first trip. There were some 10 ships there, 10 beautiful old ocean liners, the old Carnival Mardi Gras, the Stella Solaris, these classic ships that had been put out of service because of 2001. When 9/11 happened, the cruise
Mm.
industry was really badly affected. Nobody wanted to travel. So the cruise lines with all the old cool ships were going out of business, and the only option they had was to sell their ships for scrap, which is similar to what's happening now with COVID.
Yeah.
A lot of the lines are just they can't afford to keep the ships in layup, so off they go to the breakers.
God,
So
that's crazy.
yeah,
Before you keep going, let me just clarify a couple things, and I definitely want to talk about the salvage and the um I don't know, it's not salvage, but the collecting you're doing of some of these beautiful pieces. But back to the beginning, you said the Lusitania was a ship. Obviously, the Titanic had the same. I'm learning all this as we go here, but that obviously refers to the huge chimneys that 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 are the exhaust, I guess, for the big coal furnaces. And am I correct that for a period of time there, these were? I can't believe I haven't thought of this, but obviously, big jet airliners weren't happening. So if people wanted to travel across oceans and countries, this is how it was done. Is that more or less it?
there was a beautiful book about ocean liners written right at the time I got interested in them. It was called The Only Way to Cross. And they were the only way to cross. These were not cruise ships. They were not there
Right.
for escapist, fair weather partying. They got people from A to B. If you
Huh.
did business in London and you lived in New York, you had to take an ocean liner to get to England. Yeah, because
Huh.
at that time, especially with Lusitania, there were no flights at all. There were, the Wright brothers were, I think, just a few years before. It wasn't
Right.
really until the 1920s, I think, that people were actually able to take planes, and they'd have to stop, in Nova Scotia, Iceland,
Whoa.
Ireland, short jaunts to get across.
Yeah.
It was scary stuff because they were small planes, and I don't think
Yeah. They're
anybody.
probably really uncomfortable,
Oh,
especially compared to a liner.
yeah, yeah. Liners were at that point in time. Liners were really the marvels of their era. They were engineering accomplishments that every nation was so proud of, like we would say be about the space shuttle today. That's what the ocean
Okay.
liners were. So
Yeah.
they are the greatest architects. They had the greatest artists contributing their artwork to the ships. The designs were way ahead of what was going on on land in many cases, and so they were marvels of their era. And boom, in the '60s, when the airplane took over, gone. Like the old movie stars when silent
Yeah.
films died for talkies, all those great movie stars that didn't have a really good voice.
Hmm.
They were yesterday's news. So it's kind of
Wow.
like that. But
Wow, that's amazing. And there's actually like several deaths happening in this discussion. We'll talk, of course, about the actual ships breaking down, but just that concept alone of a country's pride and joy and best of their workmanship being put into a ship, and that doesn't exist to that extent with ships, does it? Or am I wrong about that? Do modern cruise ships, are they anything more than just sort of a business calculation of how much they can invest, or are there places where liners are still thought of that way?
Exactly. No, there are no liners left. The Queen Mary 2 is a ocean liner hybrid. She can cruise in the winter months, but
Huh.
they don't send the Queen Mary 2 across the Atlantic throughout the winter. Pre-COVID, we're talking, of course.
Right.
Nobody wants to cross the Atlantic in the winter. They don't. You don't need 60-foot waves, and that's
Yeah.
not a great time. But in the summer, the Queen Mary 2 is very popular. And
Huh.
instead of going for speed, which is what they used to do with the Atlantic liners, the faster a ship, the more people wanted to take it because the crossing would be shorter and they would get to do their business and they wouldn't be
Uh-huh.
stuck at sea as long. Nowadays, they don't care about the speed so much. And with the Queen Mary 2, they actually extended the crossings a few extra days so that people could enjoy them more, and they also wouldn't be burning up so much fuel for no particular reason. So
Wow.
yeah, there are no liners. Now these are cruise ships. When Royal Caribbean's building a 220,000 ton mega ship, that's purely for cruising. And they may
Yeah.
relocate it from the Caribbean to Europe, for the summer, but that's just what they call a positioning voyage and not a real.
Yeah, and they're calculating how many swimming pools can we fit, or maybe more, how many rooms can we fit, and how many balconies can we fit more than.
There's no sense of beauty anymore. Some ships
Yeah,
look better than others, but modern cruise ships, as everybody calls them, they're like giant, floating condos. They
yeah,
squared off sterns and
yeah.
very, very short bows, and then immediately the superstructure comes up and it's a big square monstrosity.
Yes, it looks like a huge Lego just kinda, like, floating. I was really struck by this. I watched your video, The Sands of Alang, and I think it was the Eugenia, maybe? I'm not sure, but the Italian one where the bow was very elegant, and the way you described it, and with those pictures from it being manufactured, and then, of course, even after it was repurposed and repainted, that shape of that bow, I wouldn't maybe have noticed it if you didn't spell it out, but instantly I was like, "That is not what today's cruise ships look like." It's just beautiful and elegant, and for something, I guess it's not so old, but still, I mean, back then, they were certainly concerned with the aesthetic of it, I guess.
In with the Italians, always, not so much now, but at that point in time, the Italians would spend more money just to make their ship look pretty on the
Hmm,
outside. Those wings on the Eugenio, they curved back in a full circular shape so that the officer on the very aft of the wing, overlooking, to see if they're docking and undocking, was out of sight of the officer in the bridge with the telegraphs. So they would have to bring another one in just to
huh,
communicate between the person on the wing and the person in the bridge. But they did that because they thought the ship looked so much better with that beautiful curve. And she did. She was stunning.
right.
But it was
Yeah,
impractical. And now everybody's practical. They want to make
yeah,
money. They got to squeeze in extra cabins. They got to squeeze in all of those money consuming venues like
yeah,
specialty restaurants and
mhm,
roller coaster rides and anything they can use to make money, they do. And that's at the expense of the aesthetics. And in
mm,
the olden days, when they had true ocean liners, the aesthetics, there was always a compromise for, yeah, they've got to make money, but yeah, they want to make this ship look really, really cool so that when
yeah.
somebody's on the other ship crossing and they see us, they go, wow, that's a beautiful ship. I want to go on that one.
Yeah. Were those ships in that day sort of private investment, speculative businesses, or were they kind of the governments themselves kind of supporting? It had to have cost a fortune, to build one of those at that time, and even today. But how is it that they could afford to devote so many resources to those?
Well, they did have government subsidies,
Okay.
like the SS United States, the greatest ocean liner built in the U.S., built in 1952. She was subsidized by the government because she was also designed as a troop ship. Should we
Oh.
have entered the Korean War and needed a big troop ship, she was
Mm.
within a couple of weeks could have been converted from a luxury liner into a fireproof, very, very safe cruise ship where some of her compartments could be flooded and she wouldn't be in danger of sinking. She had a backup
Wow.
operating system so that
Mm.
if one of the engines was out, they could use the other on the other side of the ship to control the propellers. And she could go 35 knots, which is an outrageous speed, the equivalent of about over 50 miles per
Yeah.
hour. And
Yeah. Wow.
that's what they allowed us to know. She was a government secret, so you couldn't look at her hull when it was in dry dock. It was forbidden. No photos were allowed. It
Wow.
was so hydrodynamic. She still
Huh.
exists. She's sitting in Philadelphia. She's been pretty much hollowed out, and she's been rusting away, but she's still structurally sound. And there are people that are trying to save her and make her into something like the Queen Mary. So
Okay.
yeah, the ships were subsidized by the governments if they were, on routes, say for Australia. If the British government was wanting to get people to emigrate to Australia, they would subsidize the actual sailings so that people could pay a very cheap fare to get from the UK to Australia cheaply. So yes, there was a lot of government involvement. The subsidy,
Yeah.
French line, Italian line, these great transatlantic companies were operating their ships until the early 70s, when finally the taxpayer said, enough is enough. We're not going to subsidize this anymore.
Hmm.
Airplanes do the job, so we don't need to have these beautiful ships around anymore.
Got
And
it.
gone.
Got it. So here's a really basic question, and just thinking out loud, but I'm guessing all of those ships, let's just say from the Titanic to these ones we're talking about, the Eugenia, are powered by coal, and so those are huge steam engines. What is it that's moving those things up to 35 knots?
Well, at that time, yes, originally Titanic was powered by coal, but in the late teens, early 20s, they switched to oil. So they got rid of the coal burning ships.
Oh,
Very
okay.
few of those were left after the 1920s, although there is still a coal burning ferry that crosses the Great Lakes. She's called the Badger, and she's a beautiful ship. And they have the people that own her actually own a coal mine, and they do it in a somewhat environmentally sound way. But the ship is so old and she's so classic, they want to keep her running.
Huh.
But yeah, oil was the way, and steamships had at that point in time better technology for speed. So most of the liners were built with steam engines. But
So that means an oil steam engine. You use oil to create the steam, and is that what oil as fuel means?
bunker C fuel, which is what they use, that was a standard fuel for oil burning ships. It's
Okay.
cheaper than diesel fuel, but it burns a lot more, and it
Mm,
costs a lot more to operate the old steamships. And
mm.
you had to have boilers and a lot more maintenance in a steam engine than say a piston uh, diesel engine, which is what
Oh.
all the new ships are.
Oh,
So
interesting. Those were more maintenance in one of those oil boiler ships than in a
the
combustion
oil ships,
style.
the steamships were more maintenance, and
Okay.
the people that operated the steamships were dying off as
Yeah.
diesel ships were taking over. It got to the point where only like the Greeks, who were buying all the older ships and keeping them in service and
Huh.
refurbishing them, you had to go find a good old Greek engineer that knew how to operate these steam engines.
Yeah.
But all the cruise ships that operated on steam are all gone, except for the few that are left and in ports as floating hotels, like the Queen Mary and the Rotterdam. Um,
Huh.
that's all that's left. All the new ships are diesel powered, and now they're going to LNG.
Oh.
They found a safe way to use LNG, which is far more environmentally friendly, but it's
Uh-huh.
more challenging because you have to refrigerate it to get it to be liquid form to use as fuel, and also it's highly explosive, so you have to take extra precautions with that.
Wow, but that's what they're doing. That's the most cutting edge
At this
engine
point in
fuel
time,
source.
yeah, the new Carnival ship and a couple other ships that are in the Carnival Corporation. There are
Mm.
other lines like Costa and Aida. They have these LNG ships, and that looks to be the latest trend. And where are we going to go in the future as we try to make the planet more green? So
What as a side note, but what is it about the Greeks that enable them to collect and work on the old ships? I guess they've always been a shipping and maritime culture. Is that really all there is to it? There's so much shipping there that's where the experts congregate.
yes, and also especially after the war. The Greeks were buying for the Australian Emigrant Service and also for even cheapy Mediterranean cruises. They were buying old ocean liners that were considered no longer viable. there was this one company, Chandris Lines, which actually started celebrity cruises before Royal Caribbean bought it.
Oh,
They had this immigrant service to Australia, and they were buying these old American ships because they were so well built, and they were operating them all the way up into the 80s and 90s.
mm,
These ships that were up to 40 and 50 years old with these old steam turbine engines. So the
mm.
Greeks were the best at making these engines work again when a lot of people were just like, I don't know how to fix that. Okay,
Yeah.
the Greeks, because they're really good at that.
I got to imagine to some extent, every engine on every ship is totally different. In other words, there was no big mass production of cruise ships engines, so each ship was kind of fitted and built out in its own way. So even an expert would kind of have to walk in and say, like, okay, that's probably the boiler. There's some amount of, I don't know, troubleshooting involved with these, as opposed to any other, auto mechanic, let's say.
Yes, on the old liners, that is the case because they would have so much space for the engine, and then they would need to know, how powerful do we need these engines? Is this a ship that's got to be a speed demon, or is it just got
Mm.
to get across okay? So they would have more flexibility. But there were some ships, like in the military ships in U.S. Navy, they were pretty much standard engine rooms. You use these parts over here, those parts over here,
Oh, okay.
and like the Victory ships and the Liberty ships, they were all the same engines because the ships were all pretty much identical.
Oh,
And a lot
okay.
of those engines, like if they had troop transports, they would take two of the engines or four of the engines that were used in a Victory ship, which was much smaller, and apply those to the new format and the spacing that they had on the bigger ship. But yeah,
Mm,
but with the one-off liners, yes, the engines were pretty much, commissioned specifically for that ship. Of course,
mm.
using parts that are manufactured for every type of ship, but specifically tailored for that one ship. Yes.
Um, Talk a little bit about the artists that would put their work in these. And again, I'm thinking about the Eugenia, and I'm sure you can tell us that artist, but it's sort of the same thing where it's just so hard to visualize in this day and age. There's not even, maybe I'm just not in tune, but household name artists today that I don't even know who you would hire for if there was something like this. But what was that like then? Because you made it sound in the video like these guys were huge, and even the furniture designers and every part of every room was sort of very carefully curated, and that I thought that surprised me for some reason.
Yeah, on a ship like Eugenio, you had an architect, Niccolo Costanzi, who was the guy who was in charge of that swan's neck bow and the curves on the bridge front and the way the funnels canted out in a certain way. I mean, all these subtle, beautiful elements of design, which we have now lost, I guess,
Yeah.
forever. I hope not. Maybe one day people will really care again about the way these aesthetics used to work. But on the
Hmm.
inside of the ship, you had these architects who Nino Zancata, Gio Ponti, these great Italian architects, they were phenomenal. And everything they did was about the aesthetics and the function and flow. But with the artworks, they commissioned, especially after the war in Italy, they were trying to make us forget about that little problem that we had with Mussolini and
Good point. Yeah, good point. They were repairing their image to some extent, maybe.
you stepped on an
Huh.
Italian ship, and it was like you were stepping once again into Italy. It was a country
Yeah.
of art, the country of music, the country of aesthetics and beauty. So
Yeah.
they hired the up and coming artists, the ones that they felt were the future of Italy. This one man, Emanuele Luzzati, and this other artist, Enrico Paolucci, after the war, they were the new generation of artists. Luzzati was Jewish, and he had to flee Italy during the fascist regime, and he lived in Switzerland
Mm.
until the war. So the government was wanting to make up for all of that, and Luzzati was one of the prime candidates. So when Zancata and Pulitzer and Ponti and these other great architects were designing ships, they called upon Luzzati, who was also a scenic designer, to
Mm.
do everything. Sculptures, ceramic arts, big giant panels,
Wow.
small little individual ceramics. These guys were so talented and they were so good in so many different media that they could fill ships with this art. And it was so beautiful and so appealing that people liked to sail on Italian ships for the ambiance. The Italians weren't building the biggest, they weren't building the fastest, but they were
Mhm.
building what many people were considering the most beautiful ships of their time, along with the French.
Wow.
I have to give the French that too, but the French were also building some of the biggest, like the SS France was for a while the biggest ship in the world in
Huh.
France. So yeah, there's a sense of aesthetics and a sense of beauty and dignity that these old ships had. So it's funny to me when somebody says, "Oh yeah, you're that ship guy, you're Mr. Cruise," and I'm like, "No, it's really not that. I love cruising. It's
Yeah.
a great way to travel. It's a great way
Yeah.
to see the world. But I like the ships, and I like the ones that had classic beauty to them, not just
Yeah.
these massive. They build eight or
Yeah.
10."
Can you explain or put it in your words, why is it that this in the mid-century the art and the aesthetic was so superior, it seems like, than it is now? I mean, cars and furniture, I never thought of ships, but obviously ships. What is it? What is going on in that made things that way?
I don't know if there's just one factor here, but in World War II, a lot of the great architects fled. They came to America to escape the war or persecution in Germany or other parts of Europe that were under, Nazi control. So there was this incredible stew brewing of all this talent here in Southern California, especially because the weather was so good and there was a
Mm,
market for it with interior design and overall architecture. So after the war, that's when these guys really got to start expressing themselves. And there was this new style of architecture, somewhat based on Art Deco, but taking the progress of the era, the nuclear bomb, outer space, and science, getting into microscopic forms. So
mhm.
this style of architecture called Googie became very popular. And that's what you'll see in Las Vegas, in the old Las Vegas with the Sands Hotel and that really cool lettering and those
Oh,
strange sort of obtuse shapes came from
yeah.
that architecture. So that was a way of sort of kickstarting things. And then people were appreciating what was going on in Scandinavia because they were so futuristic and so practical in their design. They didn't
Yes.
design chairs with extra filigrees and stuff. They just made a chair that would be comfortable and cut out all the nonsense, just make it as sleek as possible. And there were people like Eero Saarinen who did the St. Louis Arch. He was a great architect and he was designing furniture. So this movement started in the late 40s and really came to fruition in the 50s and early 60s. And of course, ocean liners, the new ones that were being built, were obviously on top of the latest design trends and technology. And they were hiring these architects to fill the ships with their furniture and nice futuristic design. And I
Hmm.
think it was a time before there was this mass production of things where things were still handmade and they were still,
Mm.
composed of elements like mahogany and teak,
Yeah.
beautiful natural elements that no longer were either available or inexpensive to use. And that's when they
Mhm.
switched to plastic and doing everything cheaply. And I'd say probably by the mid 70s is when we lost that really great sense of style. And by the time the 80s came around, they were recycling the old styles. The 80s was that Nagel and Vargas look that was sort of a take back to Art Deco, but a
Mm.
cheap form with black lacquer instead of, really cool materials. The
Yeah.
glass brick came back in the 80s and Duran Duran and, all of that sort of
Right.
pop star sensibility, but it wasn't original. It was capitalizing on what had gone on in the past as opposed to the originality of even the 70s. You watch an old episode of Mannix or Columbo and everything's orange and avocado green, but it's unusual, it's unique, and it makes a
Yeah.
statement. Whereas, by the 80s, things became generic and more of a nod to the past and not looking towards, setting new trends.
Yeah.
90s I can't even describe. I don't even know what
Yeah.
represents the 90s. I guess a lot of turquoise, but there is
Yeah.
a special look to it. And nowadays, the ships they function beautifully. They're good looking. You walk in, but now mid-century seems to be the driving ideal of what new ships look like. They go for that super modern Scandinavian look, but it's not the same as it was back in the 60s and 70s when you were really like you were on a set of 2001 or something walking into some of these ships beautiful lounges. Nowadays it's sort of like yeah we're used to that, and so it's not
Yeah.
special, and it's also not as well made. um, in the beginning, when I started my midship century thing, and I was buying these tulip chairs by Eero Saarinen, they were on this one French ship. These are the chairs in Star Trek, on the bridge in Star Trek. So
Yeah.
people call them Star Trek chairs. Well,
Yeah.
back in the early 2000s, one of those chairs easily would sell for $2,500 just to have an original Eero Saarinen. But then by 2010, IKEA was knocking them off. So you could buy a brand
Mhm.
new one for $150. It wasn't the real thing, but it looked
Yeah.
like it. So people were happy with that. And then all of a sudden the market dropped out of some of these original things that were once so expensive. Um,
Wow.
I think that partially explains it, but I think, there's just a lot of factors involved in
Yeah, it's tough to really get my arms around because on the one hand, it's not it takes more time and money to make things beautiful and with nice material, and it does today, and it also did then, and it's not like those people were so much wealthier that they had extra time to make it, and yet they did. So it's just like it seems like a contradiction. Like these people who, they were their lives were also, they were paying the bills, and we I know people criticize a consumer culture correctly, but people have always had to consume to live, and so but for some reason the priority like has just flipped. And back then, I don't, like you said, the cars, the furniture, the buildings, all of it is just forward looking, and it just seems like there was more time taken into the quality and aesthetic as opposed to today. I don't know what it is.
Absolutely. Well, a bank would hire a great architect to design
Yeah.
a bank that would make people want to go into it or think,
Yes.
That's a beautiful building. Bank of America, wow, what a successful company that is. They built that beautiful building down
Right.
on Wilshire Boulevard. That was then. And then when we started
Yeah.
getting strip malls and everything on the cheap, then people were just less concerned with noticing their environment and
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
They just sort of acquiesced and said, okay, I'm okay with the strip mall, as long as they've got the, Starbucks and
Mhm.
shops that I want to go to. I don't really care what it looks like. I just want it to function. And
Yeah.
that's when I think, that was part of that turn. And also the materials. As far as ships are concerned, in the 50s and even up into the 60s, they had this beautiful woodwork on ships. It was
Mhm.
it was veneers, but it was put on top of plywood, and it would be veneers from Africa if the ship sailed to Africa, or veneers from
God.
Canada, beautiful
Beautiful.
maple, sycamore. They had that, but fire regulations changed, so you could no longer have
Oh,
wood on ships. So
got
they
it.
would make imitation wood, and that was
Mhm.
really ugly in the 70s. Fake wood
Yeah.
in the 70s was horrible. They got better at it. Now you go on a ship like the QM2, which has fake wood, just a painted version, basically, very printed on a computer, basically, of what
Mhm.
wood grain looks like. You're in the elevator in the QM2, and you go, "Gosh, that's beautiful burled maple," but it's not. It's a really
Yeah.
good high resolution photograph of burled maple that's
Huh.
basically stenciled onto the ply because it's fireproof. And
Yeah.
fire is a big, that's the worst thing that can happen at sea. You think, oh, why would you worry about fire when you're on a ship? You're surrounded by water. But basically, no, a fire is horrible and people die a terrible
Yeah.
death because they're stuck on a ship that's, a raging.
Yeah, well, this morning I saw a news article, a ship off the coast of Africa. I don't know if you saw this, but 140 people, I think 140 people died. This just happened. It was like a not a transport. I can't remember, some type of ferry, and this just
Ferries,
happened.
those little African ferries,
Yeah.
probably.
And
Yeah.
I was reading it. I knew we would be speaking, and I was thinking about ships, and it occurred to me like, are people drowning or what's going on? And then the article said like, no, a fire broke out, and yeah, you're out. You're all by. There's nowhere to get away from it. I guess when you're on a
Yeah.
ship, right?
You can't get off the ship, but like the lifeboats are disabled. That's
God.
it. You're doomed. So
Yeah.
but the ships are, they have fire safety compartments on the newer on all
Mhm.
ships, but probably I don't know this latest news incident. It might be some old, poorly maintained ferry,
Yeah.
overcrowded, and it caught on fire, and that happens a lot in a lot of
Yeah.
third world countries where they don't have a lot of safety laws. But again, I'm sort of
Yeah.
out of turn on that one.
Yeah. Well, the last point on this topic, and then we'll move on. But I was thinking about just homes, even, and in terms of valuing beauty and aesthetic, and how I was in real estate for several years, and an appraisal on real estate is almost entirely based on the size. They're not allowed to take into account how it looks. And I ran into a few situations where, sure, a house may have been smaller, but it was the intangible, the beauty, like just the aesthetic was made it so much more valuable than maybe like a built-in 2001 tract style home that was bigger. But the appraisal, and I argued with them about this, but they're like, sorry, it's not, it's only worth X. And they are incapable of attributing value for some of those intangible. They're not intangible, they are tangible, but maybe they're just I don't know, the things that can't be measured, the beauty, I guess. It's harder to measure beauty, so they
I,
don't.
they have to put them all, they have to use the same standard, I guess, for every single house. So it's about where is it located?
Yeah.
Is it in a fire zone? Does it have a view? How big is it? And all the things like what's inside, or there might be a creek running by or something that makes it really more appealing. Yeah, I guess they can't consider that stuff because
Yeah.
that's easily changeable, and what I
Yeah.
think is beautiful and what you think is beautiful, the guy next door probably thinks, God, get something more modern, who wants that?
Yeah, but there are places like with these ships when you put some of these old liners against a modern one, and anybody can look at those and just you don't have to be an expert to identify that. So let's talk about this. Might be the saddest part of our conversation, and it's just so hard for me to still grasp. But there comes a point where the highest value of these old liners is scrap, and there's really no other options, huh? No way to turn them into hotels or hospitals and nothing else.
Well, a really great way to lose money, just ask the operators of the Queen Mary, is to
Yeah,
invest in an old ocean liner becoming a floating hotel
yeah,
or museum. The problem is, you think, okay, it's made of steel, it's invincible, right? But
mm,
unfortunately, no, steel rusts.
mm-hmm.
And over a long period of time, if a ship is in, say, salt water, Queen Mary, the poor thing, she hasn't been dry docked since 1967. They coated her
Wow.
hull with special paint, and they go down and check and they make sure everything's okay. But it would be so nice if they could just get her into a proper dry dock. But A, that would be a fortune. And B, there is no dry dock anymore in Long Beach.
Mm,
When they brought her to Long Beach, they had the naval shipyard and they used that. Well, they filled that in. So the nearest dry dock would be in San Diego. And the ship has been compromised. They cut out so much of the infrastructure that her hull is not strong enough to support the ship being towed out to sea. So they'd have
oh,
to rebuild their infrastructure. It gets very, very complicated.
mm,
Aside from that, you've got plumbing. Plumbing goes bad, and that these systems on most cruise ships, especially now, an entire deck is operating on the same system. So if one pipe gets clogged, that screws the next, 10
yeah,
cabins down from that one cabin. So that
yeah,
becomes awful. They have to tear out paneling and repair, old plumbing and wiring.
mm,
Wiring gets old as well. And again, you have to go back into the infrastructure of the ship in order to make those repairs. That's
yeah,
excluding engine rooms that need to be upgraded or, modified. Old engines, if they're running constantly, they need new parts, new labor.
yeah.
So it becomes very, very expensive. So you look
And
at
the safety issues, like you said, if a old ship is more likely to burn, it doesn't work these days, and thankfully.
well, the in 2010 was the last great exodus of ships that were still functioning properly and they were still safe, but they had new safety of life at sea laws that prevented any woodwork from being involved in a ship, even in the construction behind the scenes, to build the framework for the stairs. That all had to go. So they were perfectly good ships going to the scrapyard. They were glistening, their paint was shining, their windows were clean, they were filled, looking beautiful, but they were no longer legally able to be used on overnight
God.
service. So off to the scrappers they went. And then, of course, I was following those ships. That was the last batch of great ships that went at the time. So yeah, it's a number of factors. And unfortunately, and this is my big thing, is why aren't people more interested in these ships? Because unlike a car is small, it's beautiful, but it didn't go across the ocean, It didn't
Yeah.
carry 2,000 people. It, wasn't the size of a skyscraper and
Yeah.
designed specifically for that purpose. And then the
Hmm.
interiors, the beautiful artworks and the flourish of the design on, say, a classic liner like the Queen Mary. It's remarkable when people actually experience it, and see it in person. Then they
Yeah.
start to get it. But the world at large just doesn't care about ships unless it's taking them on a holiday and they've got
Yeah.
18 specialty restaurants and they've got
Yeah.
balconies and they've got a big spa and a
Yeah.
roller
Casino.
skating rink and a rock climbing wall. They're not
Yeah.
interested in all that other stuff. And I hope
Huh.
that changes. I hope people go back and find ships interesting because they really were. They carried, in the 50s in the 60s and the last, what they call the last of the golden age. They were carrying all the movie stars and
Yeah.
Eisenhower and Truman and Kennedy and all the politicians and the leaders of the world were crossing on ships. They were dining in the restaurant and people were in
Hmm.
awe of what was going on around them. They had great
Mm.
bands playing and they weren't all about big Broadway style shows, but they were elegant and people got dressed up and they looked their best and they were proud to be on, say, the SS United States or one of the queens,
Yeah.
SS France, because they were symbols of prestige and accomplishment. And they're just not that anymore. People look down on cruise ships because they think they're tacky or they're bourgeois or whatever. And
Yeah.
I disagree with that too. They're an incredible vacation and they offer so much, for
Yeah.
price paid. You're getting fed, your hotel is moving from point A to point B, you're not unpacking and repacking. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to spend some time at sea, which is to me the greatest way to calm and relax yourself is sitting on a balcony or a promenade deck
Yeah.
staring out at the ocean and looking at some beautiful harbor as you're entering or going through the
Yeah.
canal.
Yeah, it's kind of like going, let's say, going to the beach for the first time, and it's really amazing and impressive, and you feel the same thing everyone else felt when they came to the beach the first time. And I went on a couple cruises, and they weren't nothing special, but I really felt connected with ancestors who made livings and livelihood and explore. I don't know, when you're on a big boat at sea, like it was really fun just being on that Carnival boat and thinking like I'm on a huge ship and this is cool. And you go, you can everything about it was just cool. So I'm definitely a fan, and it just kind of and we'll put some of these pictures up. If you guys are listening to this only, I definitely recommend you watch the video because we'll put some shots up. But maybe you can talk about what it's like for these ships at the end of the road. And I know you were in Alang and maybe some other spots, but what's that like? Because it looks like it's just a bunch of guys going nuts with a cutting torch, but the thought process of dismantling one of these ships is almost more mind-boggling than assembling it. Because when you're assembling it, you probably have cranes and guys with whistles and lookouts, but on the beach, they just beach it and start cutting. That it just looks unbelievably dangerous and hazardous, and it just looks terrible. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, it's an incredible process. It's horrifying to us as Westerners because of the safety standards and the pollution uh, situation is very unfortunate. Ships tend to be very toxic things, especially ships that were built back in the days when they were using asbestos insulation.
Mm-hmm.
There's PCBs in the paintwork. There were all sorts of toxins in the fuel, the oil. A lot of stuff on ships is just not clean, and it needs to be remediated in a proper environment, which is extremely expensive. We have scrap yards in America, in Brownsville, Texas, where we pay the scrappers to do the demolition of the old U.S. warships and troop ships and ships that are in the merchant navy that are laid up in places around the U.S. when they're no longer viable. But with these yards in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and even in Turkey, they're in third world or second world countries where they really need the steel. They have cheap labor. They don't have great environmental laws. And in India, where I go, Alang, they have a 30-foot tidal variance. A ship
Mm.
in the 80s accidentally got beached there when the tide went down. It got stuck on the beach and they couldn't get it off the beach, so they scrapped it there. And then went, oh, wait a minute, this is a new thing. We could do this,
Huh.
So they started buying ships and intentionally beaching them at very high tide. Tide goes down, the workers go aboard, they strip the ship of everything that's on board, and they start cutting. And the more they cut, the lighter the ship gets, and then they start dragging the ship up to shore, and gradually the ship disappears. They cut these big giant chunks, drag those ashore, and cut those down more and more and more until they're about 6 foot long, what they call plates. And they take those plates, load them up on trucks, and take them off to the steel plants where they're melted down into rebar for construction. Huge, huge industry in India, especially because India's economy has been
Wow.
burgeoning, and they're building
Yeah.
new, they're building roads, they're building buildings,
Yeah.
have an infrastructure now where they need the steel. So that was
Right.
a cheap way for the Indians, and they have the labor. Even though
Yes.
it's dangerous, almost all industry in India is dangerous. Clothes
Yes.
manufacturing, they just don't have the type of safety laws that we do, although they are improving
Hmm.
significantly, especially even from when the time I started going to India for the first time back in the early 2000s. They're wearing hard hats now. They're wearing boots. They're wearing goggles. They're covering themselves up, and asbestos now can be remediated in giant pits where they actually burn it at a super, super high temperature. And asbestos itself can burn just like anything else. And
Oh.
then they bury it safely, supposedly. So it's a lot better than it was. It's still not
Yeah.
perfect, which is why ships are now going to this place in Turkey called Aliyah, because the EU has sanctioned them. They said they're okay. Certain yards there are taking care of the toxins in a way that's more acceptable. So Carnival and Royal Caribbean, when they sold this latest batch of ships, they sold them to Aliyah instead of Alang, because at
Hmm.
least there, Carnival and Royal Caribbean won't later be blamed for selling
Oh,
their ships and polluting. So they took a lot
got
less
it.
money. So they've done a semi-noble thing by
Yeah.
scrapping the ships there. Uh,
And I'm sure that Turkey and the Eastern European countries need rebar and steel
yeah.
also. It's
Oh, yeah.
it's the
Turkey,
steel is going into the commodity market for steel and will be put to its highest and best use.
definitely.
Wow. So
Yeah.
I take it you're during your first trips to Alang, you saw guys doing this without hard hats and without proper boots and
A little bit, yeah, and it was very hard for me. I am at heart an environmentalist. I've
yeah,
been a Greenpeace kid since 1969 when I learned about what Earth Day was, and that it's in my blood. I care about
sure.
the environment. I'm from Southern California. I
Yeah.
throw trash out my car window and stuff like that. That you'd see that in places like India and go, why are they doing that? They're just not
Oh,
educated. They don't know any better. Their
yeah.
priorities are, we need to eat, we need,
Yeah.
to sleep, in a shelter. If
Yeah.
we're living in monsoonal conditions or 120
Mhm.
degrees heat during the summer. They're not worried about, okay, what's the
Yeah.
world going to be like in 40 years? Their life expectancy is much
Yeah.
less. They're worried about, okay, if I go to Alang and I work on one of those ships and I cut it down, it's dangerous, but so is work in my hometown. There is no work in my hometown. I'll make
Yeah.
$2 a day in Alang. I can send $1 to my family in whatever province in India they live. They
Yeah.
will be supported by my work, and I will live an okay life. I'll get fed, and I'll be able to live in a shelter in Alang. It's not, the Hilton Hotel by any means, but it's better than the other options they have. So
Yeah.
for the Indians, they resent us going there and saying, that's not cool. You guys can't be polluting the beach, and you got to have
Yeah.
safety standards, because we have a different standard of life. So we
Yeah.
impose that on this third world country where people are struggling in general. They've got a billion
Yeah.
people living in India. We have a third that in twice as much space. We're more than twice as much space. So
Yep.
we have a completely different lifestyle. So I
Hmm.
understand their perspective and ours. And that's made my work there much more difficult.
Hmm.
I go there and I see these unbelievable scenes on the beach, and my friend Kaushal is like, you can't photograph that
Hmm.
because that doesn't make us look good. I can't get
Hmm.
him into trouble. He's sneaking me in there. The Indian government doesn't want me there. I'd be thrown out. But if he were to be caught, they would make life very difficult for him. He lives there. So I abide by his rules. I don't shoot things that he says I can't shoot. The
Hmm.
police are on the beach most of the time. looking for people like me, Westerners, because Greenpeace has gone there and they've really embarrassed the Indian government. All the power to them, because it
Right.
created the changes that have been happening. But my job is a historian. I go there to document and to preserve this piece of history. So I make a deal with Kaushal that I don't, expose a lot of things. I don't see them so much anymore, though. My last couple of trips have been very encouraging. I've actually had workers on the ships tap me and say, "Take my picture,"
Mm.
because I'm wearing the right gear. If you're going to
Yeah.
photograph this,
Oh,
make sure
yeah.
you get the word out that we're doing it
Yeah.
the right way. And there
Yeah.
are some scrap yards are better than others. Some in India really abide by the rules and they take good care. And a lot of the ship owners are very careful. They'll go scout out who's the best person we can sell our ship to when it goes, to make sure that they won't be polluting and doing all the horrible things that
Do
some
you
of
have
the.
any idea how that works? Do the different scrap yards like bid on a given ship in its entirety and just sort of guess what they're going to get out of it? Or
Well,
how does that work?
okay, it starts when the ship is put up for sale. Ship brokers come in, just like a real estate broker. A ship broker will manage the sale of the ship. So they'll make announcements, they'll advertise to the scrappers or to any other cruise lines that, hey, I've got this 7,000-ton, 300 passenger ship built in 1957 available. It's in Piraeus, Greece.
Hmm.
You can come and inspect it. So the shipbreakers will send their agents over to inspect the ships. They're buying the ships based on lightweight tonnage, which is what the ship weighs in steel when it's empty. So that's how they make their deals for the actual purchase of the ship.
How do they know that number? Is that sort of attached to the ship
Yeah,
since it was
yeah.
manufactured?
Lloyd's register of shipping. There's
Oh.
deadweight tonnage. There's lightweight tonnage, gross tonnage,
Oh,
which
okay.
space. Um, all of that info is available, and then they can
Mhm.
go and inspect it, and they can actually see what type of steel is it. High quality steel.
Mm.
Americans built the best steel, had the best steel in their ships. So old American ships might command a slightly higher price than, say,
Right.
a British ship built in the 50s when steel was short and they were using all sorts of minerals that would
Hmm.
make more steel, but it was more brittle and not as good a quality. So
Right.
yeah, they look at all of those elements, but the main driving factor with scrap is the metal, the steel. When they get
Hmm.
it over to India, how much are they going to be able to sell that for on the current market? And with Alang, they have this extra market for people like me or somebody who owns a restaurant in Bombay. They'll fly up to Bhavnagar, which is the town near Alang, and they go to the shops and they buy the furniture that they need for their restaurant and take it back. So they figured that out and they made a good use of this, because before they were just burning it or trash. You know,
Oh my gosh, that must have broke your heart when you
oh,
learned that.
even after I started going there was this
Yeah.
beautiful art panel by Paolucci. Uh, Probably, I was buying it because it was historic and beautiful, but it could sell at Christie's for maybe $30,000, right?
Wow.
4 pieces in the panel. And I told Kaushal, I said, please go get that panel. Let's buy it. And so he's like, yeah, but the holidays are coming up. So I go after the holidays. Well, when he goes after the holidays, there's 3 pieces of the panel.
No.
I'm like, what happened? And he
Oh,
goes, oh,
no.
yeah, they liked the way that one color was on the panel, so they made a table out of it. I'm like,
Oh my
what?
gosh.
The Kaushal,
Oh
when
my
you
gosh.
have 4 pieces, you need all 4. You can't have a missing gap in the middle of the art panel. So he didn't
God.
understand that. He thought he was getting me a better deal because it was less
Sure.
expensive with 3. So I learn from these things, right?
Yeah.
There's always a learning process. The first container I got, it wasn't Kaushal, it was another guy, and he'd never done this before. But the shipbreaker couldn't be bothered dealing with me, so he hired his nephew's or his niece's husband. So the guy goes there, and so he's getting me these beautiful glass light fixtures, right, made of etched glass. 1951 British. The Brits did beautiful glass work, and
Mm.
so he wraps them in a blanket and throws them in a container. Well, this
Oh.
container is going across the ocean. No padding, no crating, nothing. So I opened the container. The first thing there is a dead rat that crawled in and died. First thing I say, oh my God, this is an omen. And later my friend A rat's a good omen in India. They really respect
Oh.
rats. So it might be bad for you Americans, but we consider it a good omen. Like when you see a funeral, that's a good omen, right? Here we think it's a terrible thing. So
Interesting.
anyway, I pull this blanket and it's clinking glass, right? Well, I open it
Mm.
up and here are these beautiful light fixtures. The glass is completely shattered because he
God.
didn't bother to pack it.
Oh,
It's a learning process. So
yeah.
by the time the third container came around, they learned how to pack and clean things properly, and so it wasn't as much of a disaster
Yeah.
when it arrived on the other end. Um,
Wow, that is just amazing. So maybe talk through that a little bit. So you said it happens in the first step where they, and that would make sense, carry the furniture out, and I guess at that point they got to lower it down from the top of the ship down into the another
yeah,
boat or something, and then
roll
they.
them into lifeboats. They use the lifeboats as tenders. I have some pictures from in my first video of a lot of furniture I bought from this old British liner, an old Cunarder that used to sail with the Queen Mary. She had all this beautiful wooden furniture, and so I bought a bunch of it. And I have pictures of these lifeboats just filled with chairs that came, from the ship, and they take them ashore. And if they're in decent enough condition, they will sell them on the marketplace. But if
Huh.
they've got torn upholstery, they don't know any better. They think it's junk, so they break them down and use them as firewood. So
Wow.
I literally had Kaushal. He's calling me on his cell phone saying, I found a truck and it's full of those dining room chairs you wanted. And they're going to the firewood place, And I'm like, get me 10 right now, please.
Yeah.
So he's trying to honk at the truck and he stopped him and he did get me the chairs. They look
Hey.
terrible when they arrive, but they're beautifully made, solid sycamore or mahogany or maple, all this really great old style woodwork. So I took the chairs to a restorer and he's like, where did you get these? These are so
Yeah.
beautiful. And I was like, thank you for understanding. He
Yeah.
stripped them down and varnished them and there are dining room chairs. They look stunning. I
Wow.
replicated the original materials, the piping that was on the fabric, so they look just like they did when they were new and beautifully restored. After sitting for 30 years on a ship and getting eaten by rats and whatever, they all of this stuff, the original stuff that was made back then, pretty much can be restored as long as the components are intact.
Wow. So, so tell us then about Midship Century and how this works, because what you just described, I'm sure your house is full of it, but you're bringing these things across back to the U.S. and selling them, and maybe tell us about how that works and what that's like and what's available.
Well, I mentioned I'm obsessive. So in this one ship, the Oriole, she was a miniature Queen Mary, very small ship, used to sail to West Africa. And I got on board the ship in Greece before they sold her for scrap. And I couldn't believe the gorgeous woodwork and those lighting fixtures that ended up getting smashed, with the etched glass. So I ordered a 20-foot container and filled it with furniture from that ship. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get rid of all the furniture in my house and I'm going to replace it with this ship stuff. I'm going to restore it and it's going to look good. And all my friends who are not ship enthusiasts, but they have an eye, they can tell what good design is and what high quality is. When they
Yeah.
first saw the stuff, they thought, you're insane. Good luck.
Yeah.
I hope you get some help because you're never going to do anything with this. I fix it up. They change their mind. They're all like, do you have any more of those chairs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. New business. Music business is crashing. I can start a new business. So instead of getting 5 chairs or 10 chairs for my house, I'm getting 50. They're
Yeah.
never available anywhere else again. They were specially
Yeah.
made for this particular ship or that particular ship, made by Cassina of Italy, the furniture manufacturer. It's still in service today. You buy a chair from Cassina, it's 500 to $1,000 for a cheap chair. These are
Wow.
the original chairs made out of mahogany and designed by Nino Zancata. So they look terrible because they've got this really horrible upholstery on them, and
Sure.
the woodwork is scratched and stained. All of that can be fixed and you make these chairs look like they did originally. All of a sudden I'm selling chairs to people who are reselling them. I'll sell them for $300-400, and then all of a sudden they're being auctioned off $40,000 for a pair of chairs, from a ship that I
Wow.
rescued them from. They're going to movie stars' homes, and
Yeah.
it's like, my God, they've gone from the beach in India to
Isn't that amazing?
his name, but there's this one big movie star who was in a franchise about pirates.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Johnny
yeah,
Depp.
he's got a big house in the Caribbean that he bought after this franchise. And so this one huge art panel I bought is now in his Caribbean house.
Yeah,
Again,
beautiful.
I can't say who it is, but he's fond of mid-century, and he worked closely with this dealer that I was selling things to. So he swooped in and bought this beautiful art panel at a great price, because
Mm.
I was able to get it at a really good price, and now it's in his
Mhm.
home. So yeah, this stuff was one of a kind, and by the mid '70s, the one of a kind thing sort of went away. The ship
Yeah.
was dying. Love Boat brought back cruising in the late '70s, and by the '80s, they were doing, they were buying artwork out of catalogs and furniture from catalogs instead of
Yeah.
making them specifically for this or that ship. They were no longer as special as they were. So you don't see me flocking now to Turkey to buy some of the stuff that's on those great ships that are being scrapped, because that's not my market. That's not my
Yeah.
ideal. I love those ships. I've been on all of them at one point or another, and I'm sorry to see them scrapped. But I don't need a chair that was in the bar in a Carnival Fantasy, because
Yeah.
it's not the same thing as a mahogany
Yeah.
chair from a British ocean liner of the 1950s or an Italian chair from the 1960s.
Yeah. Fascinating, and how cool. And so maybe to wrap up, tell us, I know that and the reason I came across your name was an article on CNN about a big, not a fleet, but a big collection of ships that just landed at Alang or somewhere. And I think one of those ships is the one I was on, actually, and I'm only judging that by my memory of like the pool and the track, but maybe they're all interchangeable. I don't know. But in any case, it's just shocking. These things look like they could just turn around and go right back out to sea for 20 years. And so tell us a little bit about what's happened to the whole industry and what it's like for these ships, and in general what this whole process is like today.
What COVID did was it took every ship that was really kind of hanging in there. By 30 years, ships are getting to the point where most of them, their use by life is expired. And in the early '90s and the late '80s, nobody would have imagined that these ships were still going to be around 30 years from now. Some of the old liners that were built beautifully, very thick hulls, okay, some of those, yeah, because the quality was there. These ships
Hmm.
were built in shipyards with, eight at a time. As far as the Carnival Fantasy class is concerned, there were eight of them, identical structurally and engine wise. Each one had individual decor inside that was very unusual, not necessarily always tasteful, but very fun and very brassy.
Yeah.
You felt like you were walking into an amusement park when you stepped
Yeah.
into the atrium, party type furniture and stuff. So these ships are all there. By the way, what was the one that you were on? Uh,
I think it was called the Magic. Could that be?
the Carnival Magic? She's a
Yeah.
newer one. So
Oh,
no,
okay. That's not Magic then. I can't
Imaginary.
remember. I saw the name in the article and it kind of jumped off the page. Like, that's the one I was on, but now I can't remember what it was.
Did you go out of California or?
Yeah, it was the California cruise down to Puerto Vallarta and Mazatlan, and I did it in probably 2006. So
Okay, so you might have been on Ecstasy or Elation might have been the ship that you were on. Carnival was
y-
doing those ships,
yeah,
or it could have been the Imagination or the Inspiration, and those are the two.
yeah. I think it might have been Inspiration. I
Okay,
think that was it.
Inspiration was sailing out of Long Beach last year. A very old ship by today's standards. Not a lot of balconies. Actually, only a handful of balconies on that ship compared to the new ships. And yeah, not with all the latest facilities, but the ships were clean. They were popular. And Carnival, it's always about the experience more than
Right.
the hardware. The food is incredible on Carnival for the price
Yeah.
you're paying, and the
Yeah.
entertainment is great, and you're going to have a great time, and you're going to
Yeah.
do things. It's like Vegas. You just don't talk about it when you get home. You had a
Yeah.
great time when you were on that Carnival ship. Well,
Right.
that's pretty much what happens, and the inspiration and the imagination were the ships running out of Long Beach, and they were extremely popular. I saw them all the time from the Queen Mary. I visited them. I did photo galleries of them for various markets that I write for, because I'm a
Yeah.
cruise journalist as well as this guy running this website selling old ship parts. So, yeah, when COVID struck, all of a sudden the ships were out of business. Carnival had 100 ships in the Carnival Corporation fold. All the ships of Costa, Carnival, um, Holland America Line, Princess, and they have to pay for the crew, they have to pay for the maintenance, and all of a sudden these ships that were eking out a decent living, they were hired a higher price to operate than some of the newer ships that are almost twice the size, just as expensive to run their engines as they are in this ship that carries another 1,000 or
Mm.
1,500 people. So they weren't the most efficient ships, but they were
Yeah.
still making a slight profit. So Carnival kept them around and they were popular. Well, those are the first ships to go in
Mm.
this crisis. The two ships that are there, along with the three Carnival ships, were the Royal Caribbean built ships, the Sovereign of the Seas and the Monarch of the Seas. They were magnificent ships of their time, very, very ahead of their time architecturally, beautiful to look at. Small cabins, though, again, not enough balconies to sustain themselves in the modern cruise market.
Mm-hmm.
So Royal Caribbean divested themselves. They had a Spanish-speaking cruise line called Pullmantur, which was operating in Europe, and they just couldn't sustain that. So they pretty much shut down Pullmantur and sold all of its ships for scrap. So they went to Aliyah in Turkey because of the supposedly higher standards than there are at Alang. And that's what's happened. And the longer the ships are shut down, the more casualties there will be. There was a
Mm.
British line called Cruise and Maritime Voyages. They were one of the last people operating classic ships. They went bankrupt. Their ships have all been auctioned off, some for barely scrap value. A few of the ships will go for scrap. A few others will probably sit around for a while and see if the
Mm.
market comes back and they want secondhand ships in a couple of years. But it's been a complete devastation. All of a sudden, everything's viable. The cruise industry is a billion, multi-billion dollar
Yeah.
industry. It's employing people from all around the world. It's a great way to take a vacation, and then boom, it's over. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's what's going on, and unfortunately, we're going to see a lot more, hear a lot more sad stories
Mm.
before this crisis is done, and
Yeah.
hopefully,
Do people expect like I guess we're waiting to see what happens with COVID, but a rally in the industry? Is there any type of light at the end of the tunnel or like silver lining? Like at least we're gonna get, I don't know what. Is there anything good to come from this from someone who's kind of in the cruising, mindset?
maybe what will come out of it is people will be more aware of cleanliness. Ships have been very, very clean, and COVID's just the latest thing to happen. Ships have had norovirus or noroc-like
Mm.
virus, which is it's a very unpleasant virus, and it's you can get it anywhere. You can get it in hotels. You can get it on planes. You can get it anywhere. You touch something, and then all of a sudden you have this horrible
Mm-hmm.
intestinal thing where you're projectile vomiting and you're a wreck for days. And if you're old or you have a compromised immune system, you can get very sick, and it can be fatal. It's terrible. It's nothing pleasant. Problem with ships is somebody gets norovirus. The symptoms appear a couple days later. So if you're on a plane, you don't know if you got it on the plane. It hits you when you get
Oh,
to your hotel or you get back home. On a ship, you're still on that ship. So all of a sudden, that
yeah.
ship becomes a place where people start panicking, and all of a sudden, you got to shut down the buffet, and
Yeah.
they take measures. But they were really good at that and sanitizing. They're always polishing and cleaning and making sure ships are clean. So overall,
Yeah.
ships have been very, very clean. I think in the
Yeah.
beginning with COVID, they didn't know how dangerous the tiny airborne particles are. So they
Mm-hmm.
were really good at scrubbing things down, and then they would put people in their cabins and not allow them to go out, and they would quarantine them. But again, the air circulating into their cabin probably
Yeah.
those droplets in it. They didn't know
Yeah.
that at the time.
Yeah.
So the cruise industry got a really, really bad rap. Some of it deserved and some of it not so. But of course, ships became I'm never going to step foot on a cruise ship again. Well, people are saying to me, aren't you dying to get back at sea? I was taking 10 cruises a year. I was always going on assignment. I was seeing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Costa Rica and Tahiti and Europe and all these beautiful places. And my privilege in life was being able to write about and document these wonderful places and get paid for it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's something I worked all my life for. And now people are saying, "Don't you miss it?" And I'm like, "Not for a second. Not for the ships. I wouldn't be so afraid to go on a ship now if the population was controlled and people were all wearing masks and doing what they're supposed to do in a health crisis. The problem is getting to the ship. I'm not going to get on an airplane and fly for,
Yeah.
10 hours to, Frankfurt
Yeah.
airport on a crowded plane, breathing that
Yeah.
air, sitting next to the bathroom with the toilet flushing.
Yeah.
There's no way I'm going to deal with that until they really get this under control.
Yeah. Yeah, that's smart. Well, can you tell us? I mentioned Sands of Alang. That's the video you put together, and this is probably a few years ago now. But tell us what other places people can find your work and your writings, and some of the things you've done on this.
Awesome, Nate. Well, thank you for that plug. I really appreciate that. You can find my work and a lot of the stuff I have, and I'm still selling on midshipcentury.com. And not only do I have the market and the inventory there, I also have a section where I tell the history of each of the ships that I bought things from, and I show its life, its many different careers, and show what happened to the ship in its final days being scrapped. A lot of those pictures are very sad and disturbing for some people who were very close to the ships. It's like looking at something you love being destroyed. But for other people, it's not such a direct association, and it's an incredibly fascinating bit of history. So I
Yeah.
highly recommend visiting that site. You can find me anywhere online. If you Google me, Peter Knego, Knego, you'll find numerous articles I've written about ships, or people that have written articles about what I do, because it is sort of an unusual aspect in my life.
Yeah. It
Um,
really is unusual.
yeah, and my home is completely rebuilt. You'll see behind me the furniture here is 1950s ocean liner woodwork, cabinetry, and a door from an Italian liner. Everything
Ah,
in my house,
beautiful.
every door, pretty much every light fixture, paneling on the walls, artworks, it's all from a ship. Railing in my stair tower. So I'll get you some of those pictures, and maybe you can.
I, I would love to see them. And if you guys are still listening, we'll put those at the end of the video, maybe a sort of a slideshow. And so please check that out. And I just can't recommend everybody enough. When I watched Sands of Alang, I don't know how you collected some of that old footage, but obviously I never sailed on any of those ships, but I almost felt like a pain and a nostalgia like I wish I had in the 50s, because you see those people having a great time and you just feel I just felt instantly super left out, kind of. And obviously the ships are gone, so it's really just it's a neat and weird, and you got to take a closer look.
They had a real purposeful history, those old ships. They weren't just party boats. They carried
Yeah.
the big stars, and they were the only way you could go to Hawaii, or the only way you could go to
Yeah.
Europe. And they had such a sense of purpose about them, I think, that the new ships don't necessarily have. And I'm glad you enjoyed the history. And I do try to get old footage. I'm doing a new volume of that series. I intend to have 10 altogether. There'll be 9 about Alang, and there'll be one about Aliyah, about the Love Boat, and the Love
Mm.
Boat sister ship, the Island Princess. And I've interviewed Gavin from the Love Boat, and gone to a lot of the big premieres where the whole cast has been. So I've got a lot of footage that I'll include of them, and also telling how the Love Boat changed the way we perceive cruising. It wasn't before the Love Boat. It was only something your rich grandma did, and after the Love Boat, it became something that everybody wanted to do. So that'll be down the road. And I hope to get this new volume out in January or maybe February. I'm still trying to license some old video or old cinema footage of the ship that I'm doing this project about, and that's been a little complicated. So that's delaying me, but it'll be out pretty soon if you check the website. But Sands of the Land
Beautiful.
is available. And I've done a series of videos also, just cruise ships in general, exterior. It's like an encyclopedia. It'll be like 40, 50 seconds of, say, the Carnival Fantasy sailing by, and I give its brief history. And that's called The World's Passenger Fleet. So I have one volume of that
Yeah.
available now, volume 9. The first 8 need to be put on DVD. And, again, I could work a lifetime just doing this stuff. But COVID gotten me home, and I have a lot of free time. So I'm doing
Yeah.
I wasn't able to do when I was traveling so much. So
Yeah, well, that's great. You're getting caught up. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on our program, and we'll keep an eye out for all of these things, and everyone can check the description for links to each of these, as well as anything else, Peter, that you have that you'd like to put in there. So thanks again, and everybody listening, we'll catch you next time.
thank you, Nate. It's really been a pleasure. Great to meet you, and thank you for having me.